Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my library. If you're new here, hello, my name is Cinzia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. So today we are going to be talking all about one of my favourite women from ancient history, Boudica. Boudica, for those unfamiliar, was the queen of the British Iceni tribe, who led an uprising against the conquering forces of the Roman Empire in around 60 or 61 CE. As the poem I learned at the age of 6 said, Boudica, or Boadicea, was the queen of Idea, fought the Romans, sent them packing, served them right for their attacking. I've kept that line in my head for 24 years, I was going to damn well use it. Boudica was born around 30 CE, just over a decade before the Roman conquest of Britain in 43 CE. Now, this wasn't the first time the Romans had been in Britain. Julius Caesar had paid earlier visits to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE, but they were purely for mainly political propaganda and popularity. He had adoring fans back home. It's something I'll have to do a whole other video about. So it was the Emperor Claudius who led the invasion of Britain under the command of Aulus Plautius in 43 CE. Keep in mind that I will mispronounce words, so just putting that out there. Hey, I'm just a reader. I don't hear what people say. I don't have a social life. I don't know how these things are pronounced. You'll tell me in the comments down below. So there wasn't much motivation for invading Britain other than the basic expansion of the empire and the desire to obtain things like land and resources, both of the natural and the human kind. But Britain suddenly wasn't a threat to the Roman Empire, and their tin wasn't worth that much. However, the multiple failed attempts of invading the country, including the bonkers attempt of Caligula in 40 CE, gave Claudius all the ammunition that he needed to prove his mettle and outdo his predecessors by accomplishing what they couldn't. But just a decade into their invasion of Britain, the Roman soldiers received a copy of the Acta Diurna, which announced that at noon on October the 13th, 54 CE, Claudius had been pronounced dead at the Palatium, and the 17-year-old Nero, grandson of the still revered Germanicus Caesar, had been proclaimed emperor. The Acta Diurna was a sort of daily newspaper for the ancient Romans. It was a government gazette containing an officially authorised narrative of noteworthy events in Rome, and Nero's entrance is noteworthy because King Prasutagus' attempts to appease the new emperor couldn't protect his family from their downfall. So by the time the Romans had conquered the southern Britain, Boudica ruled the Iceni tribe of East Anglia alongside her husband, King Prasutagus. According to Cassius Dio, Boudica was very tall, the glance of her eye most fierce, her voice harsh, a great mass of the reddish hair fell down her hips. Her appearance was terrifying, because heaven forbid a tall ginger-haired woman. My god. The Iceni were farmers, cultivating wheat and vegetable crops and running livestock, including horses. According to Tacitus, the Iceni didn't participate in the resistance to the 43 CE Roman invasion. They didn't fight or surrender. They instead later signed a treaty that gave the Iceni the status of Roman allies, although they weren't exempted from taxation, like some other allied nations in Europe, and part of the Roman treaty would have included partial disarmament of the Iceni, including the destruction of the tribe's war chariots, which of course will become of note later. So most Iceni only saw the Romans when the tax collectors came and made their annual visit in the summer, or when the Roman army conquistadors came to assess the young Iceni men, for service as auxiliaries and to take the recruits away. Otherwise, the Iceni were left alone. Well, until the winter of 47 to 48 CE. You see, Lieutenant General Ostorius had only just arrived at Colchester to take up his appointment as the governor of Britain when a force of unidentified raiders broke into the territory of British tribes allied to Rome. After plundering farms and villages, the raiders vanished, and though he wasn't sure who was to blame, General Ostorius had his suspicions. So, to assert his power, Ostorius dispatched auxiliary units based at Colchester to disarm all the tribes of the region and to set up camps of occupation in every allied tribal area west of the Severn River and as far north as the Avon River. When some independent young Iceni lads heard of Ostorius' oppressive order, they tried to form a resistance with the surrounding tribes, and this was all unknown to King Prasutagus. So when Prasutagus found out, he actually sent a message to warn Ostorius about the plan, which led to a battle between the rebels and the Romans. The latter won, and Prasutagus was able to keep his throne. However, he was now more aware than ever of how fragile his family's power was, and he made his best attempts to secure it. In an attempt to curry favour with the Romans, Prasutagus made a will, which left half of his estate to Emperor Nero and the other half to his 2 daughters, in the hopes of pleasing both the emperor and his family. So interestingly enough, some of the British tribes, like the Iceni, were early women's liberationists who recognised the rights of women. Celtic wives and daughters could inherit part of the estate of the deceased head of the household, and some tribes also allowed women to inherit their ancestral thrones. This was obviously very different from Roman law, under which a woman could only inherit the property of her mother or her grandmother, not the estate of her husband or her father. So to get around this clash of laws, Prasutagus could adopt a son or heir, but he didn't want to. He wanted his daughters to inherit his kingdom, and he hoped his loyalty to the Romans, as demonstrated by, naming the rebellions, would mean Nero would honour his will. But sadly, Nero didn't get the chance to have a say. You see, King Prasutagus died in the winter of 58 to 59 CE, when Britain was without a governor, and was thus being governed by the province's procurator, or chief of financial administrator, Decianus Catus, who took, a very impersonal and objective financial stance on the will. He claimed it was illegal. End of story. And the kingdom therefore now belonged to the Emperor Nero. To claim the emperor's property, Catus and his men first went to Prasutagus' villa, where his now widow, Boudica, was stripped and beaten with wooden rods, a punishment that indicates that she'd refused to surrender his property, or rather, her property. The procurator's men then, sadly, R-worded Boudica's 2 daughters and ransacked the house. To avoid any male heir claiming the throne, Prasutagus' male relatives were all arrested and enslaved, and all the Iceni nobles were stripped of their possessions. It was then, according to Cassius Dio, Boudica, bleeding and outraged, held her violated daughters and made a vow to Andraste, the Celtic goddess of war, to avenge herself, her family, and her people. She said, "I thank you, Andraste, to call upon you as a woman, speaking to a woman. I beg you for victory and preservation of liberty." It was then that Boudica began plotting to go to war against the greatest military power on earth, the Romans. Boudica was a highly intelligent woman. Her plan to defeat the Romans centred entirely on taking advantage of how their own legions worked and using it against them. You see, 2 of the 4 legions in Britain, the 9th Hispana and the 20th Valerio Victrix, were to undergo their 20-year discharges the following year, 60 CE, a year, coincidentally, when half of Rome's legions would re-enlist. This means that the new legionaries would be fresh meat for the Britons, and if they struck early enough, they would catch them before they even had a chance to train. Additionally, General Plautius was likely to be leading his army on a campaign in the west in the spring, as he usually did, meaning they would be isolated. Therefore, if the Iceni tribes joined forces with other tribes, they could spread throughout the east of England and then trap him between themselves and Wales. Thus, Boudica started her secret war scheme, convincing tribes in the areas to join her rebel coalition, and then also she planted spies in Colchester. They carried on the year as usual, paying their taxes in the summer and harvesting in the autumn. But once the harvest was over, their training began, and their first target was Colchester. So, Boudica rode to Colchester with her rebel warriors, which Dio puts at around 120,000 men, and they rode off to Colchester and surrounded the military camp and the temple of Claudius, where the Roman military men were, and they pulled down all the Roman statues as they went throughout the city. Now, part of the badass myth about Boudica, I'm afraid I'm going to actually have to debunk, and that's her in the war chariot. You see, Boudica is obviously very regularly depicted as riding this chariot, in artwork and sculptures, particularly around the UK, but I'm afraid she never actually drove the chariot herself, and additionally, the chariot that she rode wouldn't have been a Roman-style one. So instead, she actually rode at the rear of a wooden chariot driven by someone else, very much like the one that was rendered by a chap called Hugo online. Top job work, Hugo, thank you for that rendition. So whilst many of the rebels burned Colchester, some split off into London to confront the procurator, Catus, whilst others went to Wales for General Paulinus. Now, Catus was the first to hear about the uprising, and he swiftly sent 200 men to Colchester in retaliation. Catus really underestimated the size of the rebels. Also, keep in mind that some of the men that were sent by Catus would have been the same ones who committed the horrific crimes against Boudica and her daughters, so they likely received very special treatment when they arrived. Within 2 days of the siege of Colchester, Boudica's rebel force had taken thousands of prisoners, some of whom were burned whilst others were hanged and crucified, and the temple of Claudius was engulfed by flames. Now this is where it gets very graphic, so hold on to yourselves. Dio claimed that the men and the boys had their genitals cut off and then thrust into their faces before the victims were boiled alive or impaled on red-hot skewers, whilst the women had their breasts cut off and sewn to their mouths and then impaled on the sharp skewers running lengthways through their bodies, all in the name of the goddess of victory. Boudica wasn't leaving anyone alive. No one was to be sold or held ransom. All were fated for brutal, violent death. But the battle wasn't over yet. General Cerealis responded to the Colchester garrison's plea for help, but he either, again, wasn't told about the size of Boudica's rebel army, or he completely underestimated it, because he only took 2,000 heavy infantry and around 500 mounted troops to confront Boudica's army, which was now around 230,000 people. Before they even reached Colchester, the rebels nearby wiped out 2,000 men easily. General Cerealis was then forced to take his few surviving troops to Colchester, with the hope of finding more to join his forces when he arrived there, whilst a messenger took the news of the Roman loss to London. Upon hearing the news of the deaths, Catus, terrified, boarded a ship and fled to Gaul. Bye-bye Catus, that's the last we'll hear of him. Meanwhile, General Paulinus, still in Wales, was massacring the people of Anglesey to eradicate all traces of Druidism. He was having a whale of a time. But when he finally received a message about the attack on Colchester, he turned back with just a few of his soldiers, leaving a couple on to destroy Anglesey whilst he was away. Just like Cerealis, Paulinus underestimated the size of the rebel forces until he heard the news about 2,000 men of Cerealis's had been lost. Paulinus didn't have those kind of numbers to lose, so he called in reinforcements in the form of the veterans in Gloucester before marching to Colchester, now with around 10,000 men. Still, the odds were stacked against him. By this time, the Romans were reporting that the rebels had killed around 250,000 soldiers, and people had begun to flee the country. This was when Boudica and her rebels came to London, and no one was spared. Not even the local Britons. Anyone who hadn't joined the rebels was seen as Roman collaborators who deserved being tortured and slaughtered. Tacitus and Dio estimated that the rebels killed between 70 and 80,000 Roman citizens and allies within a week, and the reinforcements for the Romans were nowhere to be seen. So in this time, General Paulinus had tried to retreat, but realising that it was basically impossible, and that they'd either have to fight or just willingly die, he decided to confront Boudica and her men and fight. But he had an ace up his sleeve. He chose the location of the final battle. Now, the location of the final battle is still unknown. Some historians favour a site somewhere along the Roman road, known as Watling Street. Additionally, Mandaeusodum in Manchester, near the modern town of Atherstone in Warwickshire, has also been suggested, but there's nothing to say that a battle took place closer to Coventry. So, according to Tacitus, Paulinus chose an advantageous spot for battle. It was a steep, narrow passageway with wood behind it. So the next morning, Boudica and Paulinus went into battle. Boudica apparently drew up in her chariot, her waist-length red-brown hair flowing behind her like a cape, whilst her daughters kneeled in front of her. Now, some legends claim that her daughters had actually cut off their breasts in protest to what the Romans had done to them, but these are very likely inspired by Dio's accounts of what the rebels did to the Roman women with the breast stitching to the face, etc. So the rebels cheered their queen before she addressed her warriors, spear in hand, and she said, "I know it's unusual for Britons to fight under a woman's leadership," Tacitus documented, "but forget that I am a woman or a member of the royal family. Now I am one of you, regaining my freedom, avenging my scourged body and the lost chastity of my daughters. The gods are on the side of the righteous vengeance. In this battle, you must conquer or die. This is a woman's resolve. As far as you men, you can choose to live and be slaves if you wish." The Britons roared and charged forward, but the Romans stayed very still and silent, waiting for the Britons to be in range of their javelins. You see, the rebels only had shields for protection and bore spears and flat double-edged swords, whilst the Romans had full armour, including helmets, and bore javelins and short swords. The Romans formed a wedge-shaped formation and began slicing through the rebels' hand-to-hand combat. The narrow passage made it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for the rebels to use their long weapons, and when the Britons began to retreat, they were accidentally blocked by their own women in wagons, who had all drawn up to watch, assuming victory. The Romans were outnumbered 12-1, but the narrow battlefield proved impossible for the rebels to fight in. Interestingly, Paulinus' choice of battle tactic is actually reminiscent of that made by Themistocles, the Athenian general, in the narrow straits of the Salamis, in which he chose to fight against the massive Persian fleet. Within just a few hours, the Britons were almost completely wiped out by a few Roman soldiers. Tacitus claims that 80,000 Britons and 400 Romans were killed in the battle. But this disparity was likely used to emphasise, the great Roman strength against the rebels. However, needless to say, they really slaughtered them with their tactic. Boudica and her daughters fled the scene and were later found dead. According to Tacitus, she had poisoned herself, whilst Dio claims that she died of a mysterious illness. Very quick and convenient. But with her death, the Romans defeated the rebels, making their unlikely victory one of the most legendary battles. A single Roman legion wiped out over 200,000 men. So, as you can imagine, they wanted to avoid any more uprisings in the future, so harsher measures were put on the indigenous tribespeople of Britain. Martial law was implemented, and Paulinus executed the leading tribesmen of villages and towns that he believed were hostile towards the Romans, and took their farm and lands away. On top of that, because the tribes had neglected their land whilst training and preparing for the revolt, their fields were barren, and they were struck by a horrific famine, and Paulinus, gloating, refused to help any of them. And obviously Catus, who fled the scene, was removed from his post and never heard of again. It's kind of ironic that the woman who destroyed London has a statue of herself there, but Boudica is seen as a national heroine, despite her defeat and her less than exemplary behaviour. Much like her male counterparts across ancient history, her leadership and the consequential mass violence of it are overlooked and truncated into unspecific verbs like defeated or conquered, verbs which remove the images and the scale of the blood, gore, abuse and death and torture. We can't hear the screams and cries of fear and pain of our admired leaders, but many people can visualise and feel their passion. Boudica fought as a woman, and that was damn rare. She had a fierce intelligence and strategical knowledge, and she suddenly avenged her daughters through her exemplary demonstration of female power. But it's always funny and interesting when you're reading about war figures to see who gets labelled as a hero, and who gets labelled as a savage, who gets seen as a soldier, and who gets seen as a rebel. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing if you're into ancient history or history discussions or even bookish discussions. Thank you to my patrons for making this channel possible and supporting today's video. I am over on a second channel as well, streaming on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays and Sundays if you're interested in work from home and study with me videos. And I also have a podcast. Everything I've mentioned is linked down below. Thank you again for watching, and I hope you are happy and healthy. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.